So I think we can start, or maybe give it just a couple of one more minute or so to make sure that those who want to participate is in the Zoom room. So I think we start now, and I think those of you who have attended other sessions have seen this compliance reminder before. It basically says that since you registered and participated in this event, you agree to abide by the Code of Conduct, Anti-Discrimination, Harassment and Retaliation Policy. And we look forward to this conference that is now, well, the last day actually, but I think it has been, and it will continue to be characterized by mutual respect and collaboration. So by saying that, I would like to welcome you to this session on disinformation, data collection, and the weaponization of environmental harm during armed conflict. My name is Annika Walley. I'm with the Swedish Defense Agency in Sweden. And I have been working in this field for the past 20-something years, mostly from a perspective of soldiers' health while operating in conflict areas. I would like to introduce our panelist, Emma Hakala, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Helsinki. She is also a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and is currently working on the Toxic Crimes project, which explore legal activism against wartime environmental harm. Our second panelist is Dr. Margarita Renko. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. She holds a PhD from Central European University in Austria and currently serves as a consultant on conflict-sensitive education at UNICEF in Ukraine. And her field of expertise also includes regional actionist and great power politics, conflict dynamics, and peace building. And our final, last but not least, panelist is Dr. Freck from der Vet. He is a university researcher at the Eric Castren Institute of International Law and Human Rights at the University of Helsinki. He is the principal investigator of the Toxic Crime Research Group on legal activism against wartime environmental harm. His past research also concerns strategic litigation in international courts, legal mobilization under authoritarianism, and the protection of human rights defenders. And by that, I will invite Dr. Hakala to start her presentation, followed by the other two panelists. And after that, we will have approximately 30 minutes for Q&A. And please put your questions in the chat and address if it's a question that is open to all the panelists or if it's for a specific person. And also, please remember to mute yourself when you're not speaking. During past meetings, there has been a lot of dog barking and strange noises during conferences, and it can be distracting. So without further ado, please, Dr. Hakala, if you're ready.
Yes, thank you for the great introduction. I hope you can see my screen. I'm trying to share it. All right, so thank you. And also thank you to the organizers for organizing everything so so well. I mean, I can imagine that it has been a hassle to move everything from like a real conference to an online format. So it's been really interesting still to follow the sessions, and I'm really happy that I can participate and that this conference still managed to take place despite all the difficulties. But all right, I will talk today about my upcoming paper, or hopefully upcoming paper at some point, on UNEP's post-conflict environmental assessments, and particularly the way in which they have addressed this issue of politicization, and I guess more broadly also the change and the evolution of these assessments. And I'm a little bit maybe concerned that I won't be giving the audience what they expect, because first of all, this paper is really unfinished still. Yeah, it's very much just ideas, I guess. And in a way, I did want to present something at this point of writing and get some sort of comments and ideas from people, but I'm also a bit concerned that maybe I've traveled somehow a bit, not really completely off the topic of this panel, but it's maybe kind of adopted new directions as I've progressed with the research, but we'll see what happens. And I know that Margarita's and Frek's papers will be really interesting. So if this doesn't quite meet your expectations. Anyway, let's get to the point. So basically, what I talk about when I talk about these UNEP post-conflict or crisis environmental assessments, it's this sort of format that UNEP has developed to address the environmental harm of conflicts. And the idea has been to identify these major environmental risks that could cause harm to health or livelihoods and to security overall in these conflict regions. And then also to provide some recommendations to national authorities on how to address them. And these assessments have been carried out since 1990, approximately, or actually that was the start of these, like this very specific format of these assessments. And it has evolved over time quite a lot, as I will explain a bit later. And it has really kind of transformed its character in many ways, and that's also maybe one kind of problem that I've had with trying to formulate the research, but I'll get to that also later. But the first assessment took place after the Kosovo conflict in 1999. And after that, these assessments have been carried out, for example, in Afghanistan and Lebanon and many other countries as well. And one of the sort of characterizing aspects, I would say, about these assessments has been that UNEP has kind of presented itself as providing this sort of neutral and unbiased perspective in situations where there are very conflicting ideas and often also very politicized ideas about the environmental harm, and there maybe are different interests as to how information about the harm to environment can be used. So in that sort of setting, UNEP has kind of argued that it, as an international organization, it can provide this sort of neutral perspective into this. And it has very much sort of emphasized this neutrality role, I guess. And this is something that has been also challenged quite a lot in research, for example. So this then kind of provides an interesting setting for researching the topics of this session, for example. Oops. Okay. then if we look more somehow broadly at the whole issue of conflicts and environmental politicization, of course, there is a lot to talk about and a lot that we could focus on, but specifically with regard to the whole idea of somehow assessing the damage to environment caused by the conflict, and also maybe the sort of post-conflict setting and everything. There are maybe a few aspects that need to be taken into account, and many of them are quite obvious, such as the fact that conflict situations and post-conflict situations are very politicized, obviously, and there are usually very different interests on behalf of different actors regarding everything, obviously, but also regarding the environmental data. And sometimes these sort of conflicting interests kind of might encourage some actors, for example, to use this environmental data or information about the environment to somehow sort of promote their own interests or their own agenda or whatever. And then in some ways, as I mentioned, international organizations such as UNEP can be seen as these kind of voices that represent not only one interest, but a broader sort of range of actors, and that are supposed to be very politicized and in that sense unbiased. And this is something that has been researched quite a lot, I would say, in different contexts, but also actually in the context of UNEP specifically, and also with regard to these assessments by my colleagues Margarita Lewis and Lucille Martens, who actually wrote a really interesting book about this called "Why International Organizations Hate Politics." Kind of a provocative name, I guess, but they kind of argue that it's actually a problem that, for example, UNEP is so much presenting itself as this depoliticized actor or non-political actor and kind of neutral actor, because then that means that there actually is a lot of politics involved even in these assessments, but they are not really addressing it, or they are kind of ignoring and trying even in some cases maybe to hide somehow the political aspects that arise from the assessments. And this is also a really important issue that I somehow wanted to address, I guess. And then there is the issue of somehow securitizing and weaponizing environment. So somehow using then this information about the environment in order to maybe kind of hurt the opponent or to promote some kind of a narrative about them that kind of serves the interests of one side of the conflict, for example. And then there is also the issue of kind of who controls the, I guess, narrative, for lack of a better term, in post-conflict planning, particularly in these UNEP assessments. It has been kind of one of the aims to somehow contribute to this, first of all, the environmental peace building aspect, but then also maybe to this broader development of post-conflict regions towards stabilization and institution building, for example, and these kinds of things. And then that also raises a lot of questions about what kinds of issues get picked up into these post-conflict sort of remediation efforts and the reconstruction and so on. And the underlying question, I guess, is whether unbiased information is possible. And I would say that the answer to my own question is that it's not really possible. But then how do you address the sort of inevitable kind of biased nature of the information, and especially how do you do it as an international organization, which is still supposed to be neutral? That is quite a difficult question. And this is something that I came across like originally when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, which was about the post-conflict kind of reconstruction and cooperation in the Western Balkans, and it kind of started out with the UNEP assessment after the Kosovo conflict. And I would say that even though in this article I don't really want to get into the Kosovo conflict maybe so much, but it kind of serves as a kind of a starting point and as an example of a situation where the assessment was carried out. Because it was really highly politicized. There was a lot of controversy about the NATO bombings and about the mandate and whether it was the right thing for the NATO to bomb the former Yugoslav Republic. And then kind of as a result of that, there was a lot of this sort of tendency to either downplay or amplify the environmental damage, for example, to show that the NATO was causing this sort of really huge environmental scandal, or then from the NATO's part to say that they actually went and remediated a lot of the damage that took place and so on. And then in this setting, specifically, UNEP kind of stepped in for the first time, at least in this very high profile role, and said that they would carry out this assessment, which would then provide sort of neutral information about the situation, and that could also then serve as a kind of a starting point to addressing the damage. And this is where the whole kind of controversy about the depoliticization and sort of neutrality element kind of clash with the situation on the ground, because even though UNEP really paid a lot of attention to sort of emphasizing that that the information that it provides in this assessment is neutral and kind of like sort of certified by the best experts and laboratories and so on. But it doesn't really help the fact that even today there is a lot of discussion sort of on the ground in Serbia, which was the sort of main country that most suffered from the bombings. There are still a lot of discussions about like how the bombings affected the health, for example, of people and caused cancer and discussions like that, which hasn't necessarily been scientifically proven to be accurate. But the fact that like even though you have this assessment and the UNEP assessment and many other researches after that as well, it hasn't really sort of addressed the fears that people have had about the consequences of the bombings. But then on the other hand, you could also say that the Kosovo assessment had this very important role in kind of starting out the whole concept of the UNEP assessments, and also a lot of the activities on UNEP's or UNEP's activities on the issue of environmental security or environmental conflicts. So in that sense, it kind of contributed to another really important discussion. But then to be kind of, I guess, fair to UNEP, I have to say that these assessments have, as I mentioned, evolved over time quite a lot, and they have maybe addressed a lot of things, but not necessarily actually the critiques or maybe the things that have been pointed out, especially regarding this politicization aspect in research. So if anything, I would say that the assessments have kind of developed into this increasingly somehow neutral and depoliticized direction. So for example, rather than being just post-conflict assessments, as they were in the very beginning, they are now called post-crisis assessments. And the idea is that basically they can be applied into either a post-conflict setting or then to some, for example, a natural disaster or post-natural disaster setting, which I would say is a very different setting. So the fact even that a similar kind of concept or a format is used for both of those situations maybe raises a lot of questions, at least for me. And then increasingly the sort of issue of this sort of post-crisis institution building and kind of this long-term activities have entered into these, like the very sort of basic elements of the assessments. And rather than just having this one single format of the post-crisis assessment, there actually are several different kinds of tools or types of assessments that can be used in different situations. Some of which are more sort of these kind of flash assessments and these very quickly carried out sort of intervention is just trying to maybe address a very specific question about a post-crisis situation, for example. And then there are these more long-term assessments, such as these integrated strategic environmental assessments in post-crisis countries. So yeah, the whole kind of mode of acting or addressing these issues has evolved and developed quite a lot. And then increasingly there are these like additional topics that have entered into the assessments, such as the issue of climate change and climate vulnerability in these sort of post-conflict settings, for example. So it has kind of like the whole work of UNEP in post-conflict and post-crisis situations has really widened quite a lot.
So I didn't want to interrupt you during the slide, but it's a little bit less than 4 minutes now.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. I didn't think that I would be talking so long. Okay, so I actually don't have that much more to say, which is kind of sad because we're only getting into the research setting in a way. But I guess what I would like to address with my research or with the specific paper would be, I'm not really finalized with the questions yet, but I would like to see sort of what kinds of changes of perspective are reflected in the evolution of the assessments over time. And then how does this development of the assessments address the issue of politicization? And yeah, I'm not really sure if even the aim always of these changes has been to address politicization issues, but I still think that it's a very important question that needs to be sort of asked from the assessments. So that's why I kind of want to have a look at it. And the materials that I'm planning to use would be mostly these different assessments at different times, kind of providing these sort of snapshots into the evolution of the assessments. I'm still not completely sure about which ones I will choose, but I would like to have some kind of a representative sample in a way of the different kinds of assessments. And then I'm also considering whether I would use interviews, but I'm not completely sure about that because there are all kinds of issues with using interviews, at least in this situation where, yeah, I think I would maybe use them as a kind of a background information rather than necessarily as something that I analyze as such. And then I'm planning to somehow combine this sort of historical analysis and then the content analysis of the assessments into some kind of a coherent research, I guess. And then I don't know if this is really an analytical framework, but just the things that I aim to look at when I'm analyzing documents and maybe the interviews is exactly the sort of elements of depoliticization, or potentially politicization, or maybe addressing the political aspects in these settings in the assessments. And then the issue of desecuritization or securitization, because that has been another important issue, like how these kinds of assessments sort of securitize environment and so on. And then a third aspect would maybe be institutionalization, referring mostly to the way in which the assessments also have aimed to somehow, I guess, institutionalize environmental governance in certain ways in the post-conflict or post-crisis countries. And then through that, I would kind of look at the sort of legitimacy and credibility and applicability of the results of the assessments. But the way that I will end up with this final sort of outcome is not exactly completely clear to me yet. But anyway, that I guess is all that I had to say. But I would be really happy to hear any comments or questions and anything that you have to say. But now I will give the floor to others. But thank you for the attention.
Well, thank you very much. I think maybe you are too humble. I think this looks like really interesting research, and we hope that we will get some good questions in the chat room. So over to the next speaker, Dr. Margarita Romenko. Renko, sorry for mispronouncing. Yeah, my glasses is actually a bit blurry, so I should have cleaned them before.
And my name is very long. So
yeah.
It's
well,
okay.
Welcome to start presenting.
Thank you. Okay, my presentation actually nicely continues the debate that Emma already started about how environment can be politicized from various aspects, but I deal with this question more from a case study perspective. So also share my screen. The case I will be talking about is the case of Crimea, the region annexed from Ukraine in 2014 by Russia. The interesting part of the story that I'm very new to the field of environmental peace building. Actually, it was due to Emma and Frank that I developed interest into the subject. So I'm only diving into the area, but why this topic is interesting for me is because I myself come from Crimea. So most of the developments I'm talking about in this case, I'm observing as a participant or like a natural observer, so to say, just coming to the region. And the topic of my presentation is kind of picking on the question how environment gets into competition with other important agendas like security and geopolitics. And specifically, I will be talking about the very pressing environmental concern of Crimean region, which is the water supplies. So without further delay, I can maybe start. Oh, why it's not moving anywhere? Here. Oh, yes, it is moving. So just to give you also a brief overview, the environmental situation in Crimea, which you see on the map, changed very significantly after 2014 annexation. And there were three big developments, so to say, in the last 7-8 years. So one, the major one, which I'm also talking a little bit in more detail about, is this cut in water supplies. So basically, when the region got annexed, Ukraine, which was supplying water to the region before, and a huge amount of it, cut the supply, which resulted in various forms over time of environmental degradation. So mainly that concerns the chemical pollution, because we have chemical industries in the region, and which requires like huge amounts of water to run safely. There were also increase in droughts and loss of fertile soils because of like shortage of water. And in general, like it was a massive also hit to the population. And then there are two other trends which on this kind of side story of shortage of fresh water supplies, there is an expansion in the demands. One trend here is the increase in militarization of the region from the Black Sea Navy mainly, but also other presence of military from the Russian side. And according to some estimates, this number increased 3 times, both like in personnel and vehicles and ships and everything. And they also occupy now much bigger territories than before. And the other big trend is the incoming migration and some even resettlement policies that Russia initiated after 2013. So the number of people who came to live in Crimea after 2013 also increased significantly as to up to 1 million, according to some estimates, which has also, of course, impacted the need in the fresh water. And kind of this is on the major backgrounds of these developments. Oops, on the way. And this is just a map that I found that also kind of nicely represents the loss in water supply after 2014. So I can maybe leave you to look at it a little bit closely. You see that there is this yellow point here, which is the dam blocked by Ukrainian side after the annexation. And the green areas are the areas which used the irrigated water before. So all of the agriculture in these areas basically died out. And then most of the biggest Crimean towns that are identified in red were also receiving water from this particular channel. And there are like a number of reservoirs also that are using local sort of sources of water to fill in and supply to the cities, but they're obviously hugely not enough for the amount to cover up for the amount lost after the blockade of water supplies. So initially, the situation didn't seem so drastic, but after 8 years, the consequences kick in severely, which resulted in a kind of revitalization of debate about what are the consequences for the environment and what should be done about the situation. There were also a number of triggers to this, like, for example, there was a major I don't know how to call it, not a disaster, but disruption in the chemical plant production, which resulted in the chemical pollution of this area over here, because these two cities have the chemical plants, and the consequences took the Crimean side and the regional side, but also this mainland Ukraine side where populations were affected. And these green areas that were used to be agricultural now face like change in soil structures, and like so I don't know how to say it in English, like the salty water is getting into the soil, so it's changing the quality. And then mostly the population in 21 and year 20 and 21 was cut from like daily water usages many times because there was not enough water to run regularly. So these are just some of the kind of triggers that contributed to the political debate too. And this is where my sort of entry into the research starts. So the issue I'm trying to look at is how environmental discourses about Crimea within Russian and Ukrainian sort of political context are used or misused in discussing and settling this environmental issue, and which implications it has for the overall conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And how I tried to answer this question was basically through qualitative content analysis of political statements, mainly from Russian and Ukrainian political elites, but also local governors from Crimea and some of the civil society actors, mainly environmental NGOs and activists who comment on the issues of environment. I took the time period of the last 2 years, basically, because this is where the consequences were the biggest towards the environment and where the whole debate basically escalated between the two sides. And for like my data, I took some of the media coverages of the issue because this was the only way to get the most kind of regular over time supply of political statements rather than checking them one by one. So I used basically a database from BBC Monitoring, some from BBC News Russian service, and some from the Krim Reali, which is the newspaper that covers regularly all issues in Crimea, including environmental concerns. So the combination of those was the data set. Maybe I should also say that this is a very initial study, so I also plan to do some interviews in relation to media analysis, but unfortunately, due to the security situation, it was really, really hard to get anyone talking to me, even though I am from the region myself. So I kind of delayed for later. Hopefully, I will be able to get more like in-depth data in the process. But as to this, as to this very initial analysis, before that, also a few words about the framework that I used. So basically, the main theoretical idea behind the research was the one that environmental discourses are framed, the way they are framed might contribute to like negative or positive conflict dynamics, depending on how they are narrated and by whom. And sometimes these environmental narratives also, a little bit like Emma was saying, can be very politicized or intertwined with other agendas, political, security, other things. And they may be also employed strategically by actors to achieve certain political goals which have nothing to do with environment. And on the one hand, this has implications for the conflict cycle itself, so it can move it towards escalation or de-escalation. But what I also want to argue, it also has implications for the environment, regardless of whether it's positive or negative developments we are talking about. And also, this is an important picture to show, because this is how I use the basically frames I use to analyze my data. And here you see in the red, these are the negative ways how environment can kick into the conflict cycle. So it can be used as a weapon of war. For example, it can be used as an incentive for peace spoiling, or at various basically stages of conflict cycle, there could be different ways how it can be positioned by actors. And on the green line, there are basically the positive implications. So environment can also be an entry point to dialogue. It can be employed as like economic incentive to start some kind of a peace building talks and things like that. So basically, I just show this for you to know which frames I used when I was analyzing basically all these discourses over the 2 years. And this is like the initial mapping that I had. I have one for Ukraine and one for Russia. So for the Ukrainian side, there are 4 streams in the discourse that are currently sort of out there. One is related to the water blockade. So Ukrainian story is that it is its way to respond to annexation and militarization of the region, because they believe that by cutting the water, they kind of cut Russian military from the supplies and not making the annexation easy for them. And in this line of discourse, Ukrainian side says that supplies can be resumed only after the region is fully deoccupied. So I classify this as a kind of environment as a weapon sort of type of a frame, where basically Ukrainian side uses it to weaken as much as possible the Russian presence in the region, or making it at least harder for them to maintain livelihoods there. The second line is a little bit similar. So it's more like using environment as a bargaining leverage, when there were some ideas expressed, especially in the 2020, that we might consider, Ukraine might consider resuming water supplies to the region in exchange for some concessions on the Donbass, where the conflict is still very active. Which didn't get much support, but nevertheless, it was debated and is still debated in some circles. The third line was kind of incentive for peace building a little bit, because Ukraine at some point said that we will consider resuming water supply for population, or even in a commercial sort of way, but only in case if international observers tell us there is a drastic humanitarian disaster. But otherwise, Russia as an occupying state is responsible for bearing all the consequences for the region. So we have no responsibility here. And then the fourth one is the discourse that is projected basically not by the officials, but more by environmental activists and NGOs, both within Crimea and on the Ukrainian territory, but those are like some kind of NGOs in exile, I can say them. They express this environment as a victim type of frame in their discourse. So they believe that water blockade combined with this increased water demands on the region leads to environmental deterioration that is already visible. And that, of course, that is their legitimacy to say that maybe something should be done about it, rather than focusing only on this political side of the story. So this is as to the Ukrainian side. Interestingly, the Russian side has it somewhat similar way, but with opposite arguments. So in the Russian case, they also have this discourse about environment as a weapon of war. In this case, there's, of course, they are accusing Ukraine of using it as such a weapon to revenge for the population, in terms of the fact that they believe that this is the moral pressure and political revenge for the citizens of Crimea who supported in a referendum joining with Russia. The second argument, or the second discourse line that is also a bit less pronounced, is resuming the commercial water supply to Crimea. but without any political conditions attached to it. So unlike Crimea, unlike Ukraine, which says, oh, maybe we can consider if Russia discusses Donbass with us, Russia says, no, it's not negotiable. We can consider some commercial dealings with you, but nothing, no conditions, please. The third line is mainly pronounced in Crimea itself and only among some politicians. So it's not like an overarching discourse, but it's still present. Is basically that they say that Crimea should be completely safe, sustainable in water supplies, and there should not be no negotiations with Ukraine about this issue whatsoever, and that they should invest rather in finding alternative water sources or thinking of some other ways to get fresh water, but no political dealings with Ukraine. And of course, the final discourse is very similar to what the Ukrainian NGOs and activists are saying. This is from the Crimean and Russian ecologists. This is the same type of a line that the environmental degradation is already very visible and might be irreversible. So the only way to solve it is to get water from Ukraine, and politics should be forgotten in order to make this happen. But both of these discourses are, of course, staying at the level of activists, and they are not entering the political field. So this is in the nutshell the discourse mapping story. And there were like some tentative conclusions from this research, but I hope to take it further on. All of these discourses develop completely independently. This is one interesting trajectory. So there are these 4 types in Ukraine, and there are these 4 types in Russia. They don't interact very much between each other, and they don't interact with each other. So they are just like out there, so to say, but there is not much connection between any of them, or at least I didn't find that much of it during my research. As I said, there were some kind of ideas to set up a dialogue between Ukraine and Crimea, or even between Russia and Ukraine, about discussing the issue of water and maybe entering into some kind of a relationship to solve the situation. But of course, the political and security context right now prevents it from happening, and it's basically a political disaster for any official to announce any initiatives of that kind on both sides of the conflict. The issue of responsibility is also very interesting, because both Ukraine and Russia seem to manipulate the environmental discourses in a way that they assign responsibility to each other. And they both submitted relevant allegations to international courts, basically blaming each other for the same environmental consequences that we observe in Crimea. That is to be seen how this is going to be developed. But the problem here, it's also a bit something that maybe Emma was talking about, that none of the international organizations has access to the region. So it's very hard to obtain verifiable, unbiased and unpoliticized data about what are the actual consequences and how they can be traced towards who is responsible. So it's very difficult to say how this issue of legal responsibility can be dealt with, at least at this point in time. Yes, and the final point is basically that these different discourses and influences that we can see in terms of how environment is embedded in the conflict cycle or potentially de-escalation are observable, at least in these framings, but the problem is still that usually environment is taken from the aspects of its effects on human rights or securities, like kind of security line of conflict, but none of those take environment as itself, or environmental rights for that matter. So beyond basically activists or any kind of environmental NGOs, at any other levels, this issue is dealt with only in the framing of security politics, geopolitics, but not from the perspective of environment being a victim or having rights of its own in the line of conflict that we are having right now. But I think I should stop here. And yeah, we'll be looking forward to hearing more comments, questions on the story. You are muted, Annika. We don't hear you.
Sorry. Well, thank you for this very interesting presentation. We are well on time, actually. So please fire away lots of questions in the chat so we can have a really great discussions after we have heard the third panelist. which is Dr. Freek van der Wet. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Yeah, can you see it? Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. Yeah, the presentation I'm going to give now is based on research that is conducted in the framework of the Toxic Crimes Project, which I'm leading at Erik Kasten Institute of International Law and Human Rights. In that project, we're mainly looking at the development of legal mechanisms to enhance the protection of the environment during armed conflict, both from a legal perspective and a social scientific perspective. Within that project, I'm doing research on specifically the armed conflict in Eastern Ukraine, and the paper I'm presenting today will be specifically focusing on the politics of monitoring environmental harm and the politics around that in the armed conflict in Eastern Ukraine. So just to go briefly a bit into the angle of the paper is that, well, by now we're kind of quite familiar with that establishing the environmental and public health impacts of conflict pollution in conflicts has always been very challenging due to just ongoing violence, lack of access to sites, small sampling sizes, etc. So because of these difficulties, there are often calls to kind of enhance technical, to improve data collection, to collect more data on on environmental pollution during armed conflict. And while that is, of course, important, what we do know from other literature, for example, the literature from on sociology of risk, is that what can be defined as a risk and who has the authority to define what a risk is often depends. What a risk is often depends on who has the authority to define it and less necessarily on available data. From the medical anthropology literature, what counts as toxic or what counts as toxic exposure is often disputed or ignored or denied. So if people end up getting sick of toxic exposure, that's often denied by states or health regimes. And thirdly, from the field of disaster studies, expertise often only develops after disaster has happened and after sustained activism. So this all pushes us towards a kind of examination of the expertise within conflict settings. So without a clear understanding of how environmental experts manage political contestations around their work and how they practice their work on the ground, we kind of risk undervaluing how they produce knowledge on environmental harm and how the urgency of risk is negotiated in ongoing conflict with persistent pollution and also distrust between conflicting parties. So, yeah, the goal of this project is to look at experts, the role of the experts in creating this knowledge on environmental harm in ongoing armed conflict, how experts develop strategies to overcome obstacles to, for instance, access to sites, and how conflict pollution gains or loses urgency in a situation or already polluted environments such as Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass area. So this research is based mostly on semi-structured interviews. The paper I'm presenting now is based on 12 interviews with Ukrainian NGOs, representatives of Ukrainian NGOs, international NGOs, intergovernmental NGOs, independent experts, and industrial experts. This is still a work in progress, by the way. So just to briefly give an overview of the context of environmental harm in the conflict in Eastern Ukraine. If some of you have already attended the the presentation by Brandon Dupre on Wednesday in the panel on environmental damage and environmental armed conflict, then this might sound familiar. But anyway, the Donbass area consisting of Donetsk and Luhansk provinces has already been a very polluted area. The Zoe Environmental Network has published on this before. Has been working on this for a long time. If you're interested in the situation before the conflict, you could read this report called Coal Land. And the OSCE has kind of defined the area as Europe's most significant man-made environmental burden. So there are different estimates between 4,500 and 5,300 high-risk heavy industries inside Eastern Ukraine, of which about 80% can be considered hazardous under national legislation. There are problems of general and toxic waste disposal. The area is wildfire prone during the summer months, and especially now during with ongoing shelling. Of course, wildfires are an increasing problem. Many of these industrial sites are located in the immediate vicinity of the contact line or the front line of the conflict. And there are other pre-existing problems like dangerous mining industries and criminal activities like illegal mining in the region. Besides the industrial sites, there is an issue with toxic waste disposal of especially the mining industry. The so-called tailings storage facilities, which are usually ponds that store the sludge and the waste of the mining process. Ukraine in general has over 400 TSFs, storing over 6 million tons of waste, of which 200 are located in the Donbass area, and 75 of those are controlled by Ukraine. So the majority of which are on the territory, not under control of Ukraine at the moment. These pose a significant risk because some of them are very closely located to water bodies, and getting access to them is difficult, both because most of them are located across the contact line, but also because of the presence of landmines. So it's difficult to monitor the safety of those tailings storage facilities. So yeah, what I said, like most of the facilities are located near the contact line. This is kind of open source mapping tool launched by the OSCE project coordinator, where you can look at different where the different monitoring stations are, where the different ecological risks are in the region. So over the years, there have been many reports published by local NGOs, international organizations of environmental risks in the conflict. If you're interested, pick up one of these reports. One of the most comprehensive ones has been published in 2017 by the OSCE. And all these, in general, broadly speaking, most of these reports attribute environmental harm to 3 different issues: shelling, so combat damage, disruption of industries, and a general collapse of environmental governance in the region. So shelling, there's been, especially in the beginning of the conflict, there's been shelling of the Donetsk airport and coal mining infrastructure. One of the most widely cited and widely investigated sites is the Avdiivka coke and chemical plant that has been shelled hundreds of times. And of course, there's a risk of environmental pollution as a result of combat damage. And then shelling also obviously has caused wildfires in the region. But in general, the most significant source of environmental harm has been attributed to disruption of these industries. So industries had to stop working, or they were abandoned, which means that they that they also started leaking all kinds of contaminants in the environment. Because many of these, for example, with mines, some of the mines stopped pumping the wastewater out of the mines, which meant as they started flooding, some of the mines have radioactive waste in them, so there's a danger of polluting groundwater and ultimately drinking water. Many of the mines are interconnected, so flooding in one mine could lead to flooding in other mine shafts across the region. And then a general collapse of for example, monitoring stations, lack of maintenance and oversight in national reserve areas, which could lead to poaching and illegal hunting, which is another source of environmental harm. So all of this is, so the environmental harm could potentially lead to transboundary pollution. So it would not, the environmental harm would not only have an impact in Ukraine, but could lead to, especially with tailing storage facilities will start leaking, they could lead to transboundary pollution in Russia, or some estimate that it could lead to transboundary pollution in the entire Black Sea region. So this is really a regional problem. So yes, I would like to go a bit now into into the interview data and the ways in which risks have been attributed, and conflicts over the attribution of risks with the authority and problems of access, like how environmental experts have dealt with the getting access to sites. So the politics of risk assessments. So there have been, especially in the beginning, quite a few. Well, one of the main issues was the attribution of the origins of environmental damage. So whether this was a result of the actual fighting or a result of the disruption of industrial sites, so that industrial sites had to stop working. So this is from a report or a blog post that in the beginning, which says that in the beginning, the prevailing media narrative over environmental damage from the conflict has sought to link it directly to the fighting. But at that point, the information that was available could not really confirm the relationships, and that they also warned that such simplifications can mask the indirect effects, such as that. Such as the disruption of industries, of warfare on environmental quality. In 2017, the OSCE, basing on, also confirmed that there is no acute risk of significant incidents occurring under the conditions that currently obtained in the region, which was they estimate that the overall risk of environmental damage due to sustained targeting of industrial enterprises would be low to medium. So one of the interviewees reflected on that, and they said that when the OSCE did field research in 2017, one thing we found out that the impact of hostilities on chemical pollution is actually very low, apart from a few cases. And he also reflected on that, where some of the NGOs were at that point in the beginning of the conflict were really crying out that some areas badly polluted because of the conflict. It's not only because of the combat. And one of the reasons is that there was pollution is that the Donbass was already polluted before. So these kind of things are quite dangerous because this type of reporting basically disrupts the trust of people in environmental data and environmental monitoring. Another expert reflected on this assessment by the OCHA, the UN OCHA, that the risk in the region was low to medium. Environmental risk of direct bombing would be low to medium. And they said that to me and somebody else, it was really a surprise because by this time we already have been exploring the risk for a very long time. And we knew this region. I was born in this region, and I know that the Donetsk region, and I know it's industry. The risks were very great even before the fighting. During the fighting, they increased significantly. And we've seen really accidents that polluted the environment. So I don't know why such conclusions were made by these experts, but indeed they were a surprise to us, and we strongly disagreed with that conclusion. But I don't know what the consequences are of the assessment. I think that at least these conclusions maybe have postponed environmental projects of international organizations in the Donbass area for several years. I don't know if that is true, but this expert assessed that earlier, that because of this assessment, it had an impact on future assessments. On the side of maybe industrial management, the environment was also maybe used, or the ongoing fighting may also have been used to cover up problems with management. For example, with the Sasyatka coal mine, which is one of the most dangerous mines in the world, or at least in Europe. They have had several severely lethal accidents in this mine. In 2015, there was a methane explosion which killed a lot of people, a lot of miners, and the management of the mine had attributed this explosion to the shelling. But we also know that previous incidents in the mine, in the region, and this mine in particular, have been attributed to the mining sector's lack of financing and safety precautions.
So, sorry to interrupt. You have about 5 minutes left now.
Yeah, I'm also. Thank you.
Okay.
So just to go briefly into navigate how environmental experts navigate politics, business interests, distrust, and legislation. So interviewees, they do not always have direct access to industrial sites to do the actual monitoring. So the interviewees mentioned that access to industrial sites really depends on the connections and their own experience and the way they can communicate the necessity of doing the risk assessments. So they reflected, they basically named 4 different strategies. So access could be gained through giving industry is a kind of platform at international organization level. So if certain industries had certain problems they would like to highlight, then they would usually be open to assessments. Access could be gained through getting access to local authorities. And sometimes access could be gained through direct contacts with the owner. But sometimes they said that sometimes some cases we didn't get the absolute permission to conduct research in these enterprises because of the quality of the management. That it's so low that they are afraid to kind of show or open up to external investigations. Then just briefly on that there's also a continuous distrust between both sides of the conflict. So one interview we reflected at the other side, the de facto authorities on the other side of on the territory not under control of Ukraine, that they continuously claim that Ukraine is damaging the Donbass environment. And they say that Ukrainian enterprises pollute the air too much, the water too much, and produces too much waste. So there's a continuously going back and forth of claiming, maybe using the environment as a weapon in this conflict, like Margarita just mentioned. So one example of that is that this is based on a research done by CEOPS, is that in 2018 there were which turned out to be falsely leaked documents claiming that the US services had been dumping nuclear waste in the Sivasky Donetsk river. Which turned out not to be true, but this happened at the same time when there was a threat of a mine flooding, a mine which had contaminated mine water in the Yunkom mine. So they these fake documents were leaked, presumably to kind of cover up that there was a threat on the other side of the conflict, that there was a potential mine flood that could potentially spread radioactive water in the region. So this is one example of how disinformation has been used through falsely leaked documents as a tool to use the environment as a weapon. Just to go, just a brief takeaway. So the environmental experts that I interviewed take on a multitude of roles. So they do not only collect the information or the data through the monitoring, they're engaged in advocacy, changing legislation. Didn't touch on that during this presentation, but they're engaged in changing domestic legislation, etc. So while environmental harm of toxic remnants of war is increasingly clear, what actually constitutes as risk and harm depends on who has the authority to define them. And this is especially true in protracted conflicts or ongoing conflicts, which are full of disputes and distrust over authority, of risk assessment and environmental harm. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for 3 very interesting presentations that actually I think complement each other very well. And now we have time for some questions, and there are a lot of questions in the chat. So I would like to first, this is more of a reflection than a question to Emma, that maybe looking at cases of actual assessment will allow to reveal strategies of dealing with politicization. And I think we can, I mean, the chat for the suggestions, so you can, I guess I can email to you. I have copied them into a document to have easier look on who is asking who for whom. And a reflection from a participant is if the presentations are going to be shared. Maybe you can address that in your answers. And then an actual question for Emma. In your research, are you also looking at the impacts of older post-conflict assessments, the environmental, political, and security impacts? And this questionnaire actually had 3 questions in one, but I'm not sure if it's better to take them one by one, or if you want to start addressing that, and we can alternate questions to participants, because there's a lot of them. So Emma, would you start addressing that, please?
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, for me, it's fine. I can happily share my presentation, but I don't know exactly how we can organize that. But if I can get anyone who wants it, I guess, can send me their email address and I can send it to them. But yeah, for the questions, I think actually these are related from Alessandra, and also actually Margarita's comment, because my initial idea, I think, was to actually do a case study of maybe like just one assessment, and then look at also maybe the discussion that it has raised somehow locally and so on. But then I realized that it was actually quite difficult because, and it didn't really do what I wanted to do, because I realized that these sort of old-fashioned, older assessments that the UNEP used to do, which were very strictly about like the conflict consequences and so on, they kind of ended around 2015 or around there, and I kind of didn't want to then, and I think it also wouldn't do somehow maybe justice to UNEP and the whole concept of the assessments if I looked at only very old cases and then maybe had some recommendations based on those, which they maybe then already have addressed in the newer, or in kind of like developing the whole method of the assessments. So that's why I kind of then decided I would actually look at the sort of development and the sort of arc of the the whole assessment idea. But then that makes it a bit more difficult maybe to focus so much on in a sort of a case study basis on a specific assessment. So yeah, in that sense, I'm looking more at the development and kind of maybe also the discussion around the assessments rather than like only like very specific cases. But in a way, I'm also discussing the cases in order to have some kind of a like content for the analysis. And then if I'm trying to give some recommendations, I guess yes and no. I mean, of course, that would be ideal if I can actually come up with some good recommendations that would be useful for UNEP or whoever. But also, I think it's always a bit difficult to come as a kind of an outsider, like from the academia, in a way, to and tell what the organization should be doing. So I guess I will have some conclusions, and if they kind of grow into some sort of reasonable recommendations, then yes, of course, but that's not maybe like kind of the biggest objective that I have in a way. Thank you for the questions.
Okay. And just to make sure that I hope we will be able to answer all the questions. Otherwise, you have the questionnaire in the chat. I think we move on to a question for Margarita, and it's about maybe you already have said it, but where is the conflict life cycle from, and what are the next steps in the research?
Should I answer now? Yeah. Can I start answering? Or
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, yeah, I saw that there are several questions in the comments, so I will briefly answer each. So regarding the conflict cycle figure, it's very difficult to cite it properly because actually I took it from the video of Karl Brucht that was in the Environmental Peacebuilding course on edX. So I don't know if that's his original or it was just appeared in the video and I screenshotted it, but I haven't found the original source for the map, but I also liked it very much. I would have to find where it's from or who made it. So it's really good to use. There was a question about, I already commented about this Titan plant chemical pollution disaster, which was in 2020. Yes, it was explicitly related to the cut of water supply because there was not enough water to secure the chemical waste. So it leaked into the air and caused like consequences for population. So, and also the border guards and the big area was covered both in the mainland Ukraine and in Crimea itself. And so far nobody was held responsible for it, and the issue kind of popped up, but then it disappeared from the discourse until the next disaster, I imagine. Then there was a comment about my this desalination plant in this small town on the sea coast that I showed. So yes, there was this idea in Crimea about how they can fix water supply without Ukrainian side. And there were different options discussed. And one of these was to build this desalination plant to use the seawater desalted to get the fresh water, but they calculated that this project would be too expensive, while the amount of water they would get from it would be too little to sustain the region, so they kind of put it aside. Originally, it was Russia's central government who was supposed to finance it, and there was some discussion for a bit, but as the latest what I read, they decided that won't work, and the latest is that now they're trying to search for new freshwater supplies, mainly at the Sea of Azov seabed or something like this. The latest trend also now, which is really negative, is that because there's not enough water, they dig increasingly water out of the like these deeper grounds on the peninsula, which causes significant changes in the groundwater levels all over. And it's also very bad because they say, okay, it's probably a very urgent measure you can use, but long term it will be disastrous because even more soil get affected or can be like injected with the salted water from the sea. So it's actually a very bad coping strategy to use, but as there is nothing else they can do, they still use it. And then there was also a comment about the methodology. Yes, just to clarify, so I didn't do any interviews just yet. So what the discourses that I identified were precisely from the media analysis and social media and like a political commentaries that the governors on both sides and in Crimea were giving about the issue. As far as I know, there is no like explicit political programs or policies or statements with this regard. So mainly they're just these kind of reactions to the media, or their commentaries as to when something happens that can give you some positions about it, but that's what I was able to find so far. With the interviews, I would be very much eager to do them as my next step. But as I mentioned earlier, because of the security situation right now, it's very sensitive topic for people to talk about. So most people I contact for interviews simply say that they don't feel like comfortable discussing it, even though they can comment on it on social media, but not like to be recognized that much. So I will still try to see if I can get more or not. I would very much, looking into the direction of getting interviews, but probably will take time to make it happen. I hope I found or commented on everything so far.
I think so, and actually in the chat now it's a link to the figure that was asked about for you all to see.
Now I have it.
Yeah, no, I think we move on for a question to Freck and then move back to Emma and see how much time we have left. So with regards to the impact of the conflict damage, what is the main consequence according to you of emphasizing the direct relation instead of and in direct relation of casualty? You can read yourself also in the chat if I'm being unclear. And there's some follow-up questions. So maybe if you address them in a row, these first questions.
The question of Alessandro Fazelli. What's the main consequence according to you? Are you referring to direct combat? You mean direct harm to the environment and versus indirect harm to the environment?
Yes, I'm referring to the difference between damage and disruption, indirect disruption that you explained before.
Well, I just want to be clear that I think that in general now it's quite clear. I mean, all the reports and all the NGOs and experts agree that the indirect consequences of the war have been more damaging to the environment than maybe the direct like the shelling, if you want to compare it at all. So most of the reports emphasize that the disruptions of the industrial sectors and the lack of maintenance, the lack of getting access to the sites to do maintenance and to do the monitoring work has caused, in the end, most environmental damage in the form. If we talk about the mines, for example, mine flooding from one mine to the other has led to polluted waters, polluted groundwaters, and if you look at the TSFs, for example, they are at great risk of because of the lack of maintenance, because of the lack of maintenance, basically, already before the conflict, but the conflict has only increased this risk. They are at risk of bursting and polluting basically the entire region. True, if they reach water bodies. But of course, I do think that attributing environmental damage is, of course, an opportunity for some actors to maybe reallocate responsibility. Let's say it like that. And for the example I gave with the socio-political mine, in which the management said that environmental damage was, or that the disaster inside the mine was a result of shelling instead of improper safety precautions. I mean, I think that's one example where certain stakeholders use the environment or the combat damage as maybe as an excuse, if you want to say it like that. Yeah, so just a question of Nikolai Denisov says that how do I resolve the contradiction between what the different experts were saying to you, damage or no damage? Well, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that there's been, I hope I didn't give the impression that there's been no damage. I think this is, I don't think any of the experts have said that that has been no damage. I think there's only been, especially during the beginning of the conflicts, there have been maybe conflicts over the attribution of and the origin of environmental harm. So that's what I wanted to reflect on more. I don't think, and I think that's only a natural part of environmental monitoring work, that these disputes maybe exist, and different assessments exist, especially during the beginning. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are a few open questions, but I think we first move back to the remaining questions to Emma, and then we try to address those that are addressed to all or additional reflections. The question was, are you planning to provide recommendation on how to improve this kind of assessments that you're looking into? If so, are you focusing mainly on the political perspective? And another one is, are you building on existing type of analysis? This is quite high up in the chat, if you want to read.
I think I actually already answered that question.
Okay, sorry.
Sandra, but there was another one from Ida, which is really important, I think, about that UNEP kind of is using the same tool to assess environmental damage created by natural catastrophe and by violent conflict. And this is the issue that I kind of didn't have a lot of time to elaborate on in my presentation, but I think it's really quite interesting and important. And I don't really, because I think that it kind of originates from maybe for example, the fact that often natural disasters, when they take place in kind of settings that are already also sort of prone to conflict, then you need to kind of combine those sort of two perspectives, and it makes sense to address them somehow together. But then in situations where you are only addressing a natural disaster and there is no conflict, or then if you're actually more focusing on a conflict, even if there is this sort of disaster element as well, I do think that it kind of it can be problematic and then kind of take us to the dark side of peace building, and ignore the political aspects of the conflict situation. And I still don't kind of know exactly why this has been the move that UNEP has taken, and this is maybe something that I would like to more get to the root of in my own research. But yeah, that's a point that I guess I still need to sort of figure out myself as well, like what are the actual consequences of that, and yeah. But thank you for the question.
Okay, so thank you. So there's a couple of open questions, and we have like 5 minutes left. So you can try to address as much as there is time. And the first one is if there are other poignant examples for further reading or of cases where environmental monitoring suffers from lack of access or disinformation. And the second one about what strategies could peace builders take to attempt to try counter the rise of this disinformation? Or is it better to utilize it and redirect it to ensure better data is available and that the environment remains high on the political agenda? So feel free to dig in, any one of you who wants to try to answer this.
I can at least try to address the second question, because I think, well, I don't have a very definitive answer to it, especially about the ways in which this issue should be addressed. But I kind of tend to think immediately that at least it doesn't make sense in a way to sort of somehow utilize the misinformation, or I think the fact that this disinformation and misinformation is rising makes it all the more important that we need to have very sort of credible and well sort of justified information if we want to use it for anything, either as NGOs or as political actors or as international organizations. Because I think that usually if you use something not even necessarily knowing that it's not correct, but if you end up using some sort of misinformation, then it turns back sort of against you quite fast, and it kind of can actually work against your political goals or whatever, and even the topic of environmental harm in conflicts. So I think that's important, at least, not to do.
So anyone else want to address any of these questions?
Maybe I can also comment on the second one. I agree with Emma very much, but I also think here is relevant. To me, it's a little bit like parallel to human rights or war crimes documenting. It's just like similar logic probably here. Of course, in the environment case, it might be, there might be an assumption that with the satellite images, you cannot sort of go around, actually go the fact that you have to go on the ground and ask people, or I don't know, make this really like site visits, what Frank did and everything. But I think it's not possible. I mean, you really have to verify, you have to use multiple methods, and use multiple methods means you have to go check on the ground and verify everything to make it evidence-based. So like if you take this analogy, that would be like probably somewhat similar approaches, I can imagine. And also what Emma was saying, more like a contextualized. So if you're talking about armed conflict, it should be contextual to armed conflict situation. Talk about natural disaster, it should be like contextual to natural disaster situation. But I think that also the bigger difference, and this is also what I was all constantly thinking from my research too, is like for other war crimes, they can be like, the evidence can be collected, or it can be traced back from like a post-conflict setting already, like you can retrace back and like get the evidence and establish something. I think that for environment it's much harder to do, because the consequences are usually so intertwined and like hard to trace towards like a specific actor who committed something, that it's probably more difficult this way. And also I think the fact that the environment is not like something that you like affect and then the effect can be removed, or like the damage can be easily repaid, or okay, we recognize that somebody committed a crime and that's it, because the consequences are usually affecting a much larger even like communities of people and nature communities, that it's not that also easy to, I think for the establishing like justice, that's much more difficult than to develop, you know. So I would say that probably you can use some of the analogies from other areas, but there should be more probably developed. And in this regard, I think what both Frank and Emma are doing in their research is so important, because you have to have like strategies on the ground to verify, but you also have to have these international standards or some kind of assessment methods that can be neutral enough to get it to the point.
Well, thank you for that answer. And with that, unfortunately, we have run out of time. It's been really interesting, and I'm pretty sure we could have gone on for at least another hour or so. But I think, thank you so much, presentators, for your very interesting presentation. I'm sure it has been much appreciated, as we have seen in the chat. And don't hesitate to reach out to each other if you have more questions, and contact each other and elaborate on this issue. So thank you very much for today. I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conference and have a really great weekend.